Yeah, happy to be here. So cool to see people from all over the globe. One of the benefits of Zoom is that we can all meet together and kind of defying time because it's everybody's in a different time zone. So we have evidence that the Dharma is timeless because everybody's in a different spot. And also not flying around the world, blowing all kinds of fuel and carbon and all kinds of other things. So, pretty happy about the Zoom situation. Not necessarily ideal, but pretty cool that we get to do this. Yeah, so my name is Dave Smith. I'm here in rural Colorado. Happy to discuss a topic that is near and dear to my heart. So what I just gonna let you know what we're gonna do. 90 minutes or so. I'm gonna just kind of give a brief overview as to why this might be an interesting topic, and I'm gonna do the talk first because when we do the practice towards the end, I want to give you guys a good setup. So a lot of times it's helpful. I've noticed in Zoom if I do the tell you what we're gonna do when we practice. So we will do a mindfulness in the Four Noble Truths, actually guided practice towards the end. So where to begin? Um, Well, as I'm sure some of you have surmised by now, we find when we get into Dharma practice, mindfulness practice, insight practice, however you think about the Dharma or Buddhism and that whole big kind of volume of what that means, one of the things you notice pretty quickly is that there seems to be a lot of lists. And so sometimes we can be like, is that what Buddhism is? Is Dharma practice just a list worshiping exercise? And it can be, some people get obsessed with these lists and try to figure them out and understand them and sort them out, which sort of I have done in the last 30 years. And some people are like, oh, whatever, these are just lists, they're not important. So the question becomes, what's the appropriate dosage of list understanding? And I think that that's different for everybody. I think we all have to come to terms with these in our own way. Um, but we're going to work with two lists today that I think are very quintessential. And if these are only the ones that you're dealing with, I think this can be really quite helpful. And that's the four foundations of mindfulness. We know mindfulness, the Satipatthana Sutta is taught in four foundations of mindfulness. We have mindfulness of the body or our somatic experience, mindfulness of feeling tone or what's called Vedana, mindfulness of the mind, which I know that when I heard mindfulness of mind, I was like, well, that's not very helpful. What the hell is the mind? Really, mental states, mental attitudes, mentality. And then the one that's even more complicated is what's often called mindfulness of dhammas. What's a dhamma or a dharma? Or mindfulness of sometimes it's called mind objects, which I actually don't find to be particularly helpful either. Um, and so we're going to be looking at really the fourth foundation of mindfulness and the Four Noble Truths. If you look at the teachings of Satipatthana, in particular, the work of Bhikkhu Analayo, some of you might know his book. He has written two books on it. Joseph Goldstein has a recent book on mindfulness, all great books to get. In fact, if you really just get those two books, you'll probably have everything you'll ever need to know and more about mindfulness. But one thing we see is that in the fourth foundation of mindfulness, which I think is actually more mindfulness of ideas, mindfulness of cognitive conceptualization, logic, reason, thinking. Probably what we should say is that when we think about mindfulness of Dharma, well, what is Dharma? Well, Dharma, in its most basic understanding, is the Buddhist teachings. So, probably the most economic way to think about mindfulness of the Dharma is mindfulness of the teachings. So, can I bear in mind, can I bring to mind in the busyness, hecticness of my life as it happens in real time, how can I actually apply some of these teachings to my direct experience in a way that's skillful, that's helpful, uh, that gives me a kind of sense of liberation. And this is, you're not going to do this on day one. This whole Dharma practice thing is, from what I've gathered, is a pretty slow grind for most of us. And we kind of we know what we know, we take what we get, we learn what we learn, and a lot of it is, let's just be honest, it's good old fashioned trial and error. We have things we do that we regret, we feel bad about. We say, well, let's try not to do that again. We find things that are beneficial. We try to do those things again, and on it goes. Um, so we have these teachings. So, and when you look at the fourth foundation of mindfulness, the last set of teachings in the Satipatthana is mindfulness of the Four Noble Truths. And so usually one of the things that happens with Dharma is you get lists. So you get lists that are about practices. Mindfulness is a practice. The Brahma Viharas are practices. We get kind of contemplative, meditative training lists. Then we get other lists like the Four Noble Truths or maybe the 12 Links of Dependent Origination that feel more like they're kind of a philosophical kind of list. Um, and then we get other lists that are more like maybe ethics. We get the teachings on right speech, the four gates of speech, the five precepts. So even the lists fall within different categories. I believe, and many academics believe, and I think that it's actually a lot more economic to see it this way. The Four Noble Truths, as they're typically called, which I actually have to admit, when I hear the word noble truth, it makes me cringe slightly because the idea of a noble truth to me just kind of has the stench of religion built right into it. Noble truth, truth with a capital T. And I don't believe the Buddha, and particularly the teachings of the Pali Canon, his original text, I don't think the Buddha was that interested in trying to define things as truth with a capital T. Um, he wasn't interested in trying to help us know something that we don't already know, but very interested in helping us learn how to do something. So I don't think so much that the Noble Truths are meant to be a description of reality and how reality kind of operates, although you could look at it that way. But I think it's more of a prescription of what we can do. So really, I think the Four Noble Truths work really, really well as a mindfulness practice, as something that you can actually practice moment by moment. And so when you integrate mindfulness in the Four Noble Truths, as the Satipatthana suggests, you end up finding a more contemplative, more practiced based exercise that you can actually apply towards direct experience. Now, whether these four truths, as they're typically called, are nobly true or not, is kind of a bit maybe irrelevant. Noble truth again does carry with it a sort of like almost like the 10 Commandments of Buddhism or something like that. Which for me, I never got into this practice for that kind of stuff. I as many of you, I would imagine, usually the greatest Dharma door for most people is suffering. Suffering is what brought me to the practice. It's what brought me to mindfulness. It's what brought me to insight. It changed my life in many, many ways. I'm foreverly grateful for the practice and the teachings. And this November, coming up November, will be my 30-year anniversary in the practice of the Dharma. And it has been a very long, strange, bizarre road. It's been, frankly, it's sort of kind of been a big, a big mess, a big mess that I am foreverly grateful for. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. I'm coming mostly from and I'm also just want to make a plug, mostly inspired by the work of people like Stephen Batchelor, people like John Peacock, people who have really dedicated a lot of time looking at the early texts, the early teachings in the Pali Canon, rethinking some of this stuff in a way of like, okay, like the Four Noble Truths, how can that teaching of the Four Noble Truths actually help me? How can they help me when I'm struggling with my children, when I'm struggling with people in the culture, when I'm having challenges in my life? How can they help me both recognize and overcome struggle, and at the same time open to the joy, to the ease, to the presence of Dharma? Because it really does go everything from that which is most difficult to that which is the most beautiful, in just one little list of four. Of course, we know the fourth one is the Eightfold Path, and then it becomes kind of now you have 12, and how do we get from 4 to 12? So you see these lists, they get complicated quickly. So, so I don't think the Buddha is interested in what you know. Wisdom is not a knowing game. It's not knowledge that one needs to have. And a lot of times it comes across that way. Like I come into the practice early on and I'm thinking to myself, okay, the Buddha knows something. These Dharma teachers, they know something that I don't know. Right? That's kind of how the presentation is. And if I knew it, if I could only know what they know, then I wouldn't suffer anymore. You might have felt this way, and I think that's a bad setup for us. I don't think it's a know that game. I think it's a know how game. So wisdom, the word panya, we have to remember that's a verb. wisdom is a verb. Wisdom is something that you know how to do, and if we just kind of give some low-hanging fruit examples, let's just start with the most obvious one that we've all heard a million times, and that is the teachings of anicca, or impermanence, ever going change. Does everybody understand the teaching of impermanence? You probably learned it early on. We all understand and we believe and we acknowledge that things are in constant change, right? Probably hard to find anybody to argue with that. So we know that that's built into the Dharma system, that things are constantly in change. But the question becomes, I know that, and I actually totally believe that that's true. But then the question becomes, well, then, Mr. Smith, when you're actually confronted with real change in your life, in the moments of your life, real loss, a loved one dies, a job ends, a large sum of money that you're expected isn't going to come in, how do we handle change in real time? Do we say to ourselves, oh my God, another wonderful example of the teaching of impermanence. Wow, this thing that I love, I don't have it anymore. Like, we don't do that. I don't do that. I kick and I scream and I get caught in the hindrances, and I don't want it to be like this, and I want it to be another way, and how can this happen? It's so unfair, and I get caught up into all this struggle, suffering, clinging, grasping, negotiating with impermanence. But I believe that impermanence is real. So just because I know something is, how it is the case, does not guarantee that I'm going to handle it well. Right. Another example I'll give is like we talk about suffering a lot around here, and we all probably know and have thus heard that compassion is the appropriate response to suffering, right? Well, when I'm actually really suffering in my life and I'm really, really struggling, how often do I think to myself, oh yes, I should just meet this difficult experience with compassion. I should meet this painful experience with compassion for myself and compassion for others. That's usually not the first item in my drop-down menu in my psychology. My usually first response is react, don't want it to be like this, blame, who did this. That it takes me usually a little while to get to kindness or to get to compassion, even though I know that. So again, we have to be careful that and as Buddhists, we can a lot of times, one thing that I've noticed happens to me is because I believe both of the things I just said, a lot of times I will assume that that's how I'll handle it when that situation arises. And I can tell you that is typically not my first response. That is not my first line of defense. My first line of defense is usually I employ one of the 5 hindrances. That's usually the first go-to. It's like, I got to get rid of this. This is terrible. This has got to go. This person's got to go. This thing's got to go. I either got to get rid of something or I got to get something. That's usually how these things go, which ironically is another teaching in the 4th foundation, these hindrances that we're trying to recognize and overcome. I'll get a little, maybe we can be a little contentious here this morning or this afternoon or this evening or whatever time it is that, so if we just look at the goal of Buddhist practice, let's talk about Buddhism for a minute. So the soteriological goal of the Four Noble Truths, soteriology is really just the study of salvation. And all religious systems have their kind of theory of human salvation. And so the goal of the Four Noble Truths, the soteriological goal is to overcome craving, to put an end to dukkha, and actually to not be born again into a human body. That's the goal, which I actually totally reject. I actually have enjoyed my life, and if I die and get to come back and try again, I'll take another shot at this because it hasn't been so bad. If I get the opportunity to be a human again, I'm gonna say yes. So what happened at some point in Buddhist thought is the kind of thinking around the Four Noble Truths, I think, kind of got switched on its head. So we look at the goal is to end suffering, get rid of craving, not be born again in a human body, join the monastery, do that whole business. And that's what they're after, which I'm actually not after that. So it puts me in an odd position as a Buddhist teacher and a Buddhist practitioner oftentimes. And you've probably had the thought to yourself, what am I trying to accomplish anyway? Why do you do this, right? Why do you go on these long retreats where you don't get to talk and, you sit all day and you walk, or you do these sitting practices? Like, I think it's actually important to ask that question from time to time. And I have found it to be very important to actually be very confused about that question. There's been many times I'm like, I've been doing this for 20 years and I don't even know why I'm doing this. Am I just doing this out of habit now? You know, what is the point? And if you look at the way the teachings of the Four Noble Truths are structured, if you look at them verbatim, if you take them literally, which I think is fine to do in the Pali Canon, you find a completely different message than you see in Buddhist thought. Um, and it's kind of interesting to me. I don't mean to be. I'm not trying to be heretical or disrespectful to the Buddhist tradition. I love Buddhism. I'm a friend to Buddhism, but I think it's mostly interesting. It's like that game of telephone. You ever play that game of telephone when you're a kid? Somebody says something, by the time it goes around the room, it's a totally different message. Maybe we're playing a 2,500-year-old game of telephone, perhaps. Is that, um, the Buddha defines each truth and then he tells you what it is and he tells you how it works. And so he starts off by saying, this is dukkha. We all have heard this word dukkha many, many times. He says dukkha is birth, old age, sickness, and death. Dukkha is not getting what you want, getting what you don't want, being separated from that which you care about, what you love, and these five aggregates. So he basically kind of comes right out and says dukkha is sort of ground zero for the human experience, right? And then he says the goal, he says this is what dukkha is, and he says it can be fully known, it has been fully known. And so again, now we're back in this tricky business of know. In Pali, the word is parinya. Anytime in Pali you see the suffix nna, it always implies knowing. Like vijnana, consciousness, is to know. Vijnana panya, wisdom, is to know. Sanya, perception, is to know. Parinya is to fully know. And it means to really embrace and to have an intimate, vulnerable, really existential relationship with the fact that you were born as a human being. You grew up in a society, you grew up in a culture, you had parents, you were conditioned. We all know that this organism is not going to live forever. We're ultimately going to die. And that it really confronts us, and Dharma practice really confronts us with that big issue at hand is, okay, from what I've gathered, I got one chance at this. What do I actually want to do with this life? Right? Which is a question I would imagine many of you struggle with or think about, probably a lot more than you might to admit. I don't like to admit how much I think about that, but I think about this stuff all the time. Why am I here? What am I doing? What's the point? And so so I think that the first noble truth is not a truth that one should believe in, but it's a practice. It's a task. Stephen Batchelor calls them these tasks, which I think is a really great terminology, is how do I continually confront the existential experience of having to live in this Dave Smith experience, getting sick, growing older, constantly things that I want to happen don't happen, uh, constant disappointment, constant setbacks, children get sick, parents die, nothing's very reliable, nothing's really stable. How do I embrace that? How do I come to terms with that? And so part of mindfulness is an existential aspect to mindfulness, which I think is actually part of the first foundation. The first foundation of mindfulness is to be mindful of this body, this body, these 32 parts, to really be aware of, I think probably we would say in modern terminology, my somatic experience, my physical body, my emotional body, my body, which came with fear and shame and sadness and anger and joy. These are much more experienced and features of my body than they are of my psychology. These things are, I was born into this organism that kind of has a lot of pre-programmed notions. How do I embrace that? And so the first foundation of mindfulness, the Buddha, and actually one of the teachings in the first foundation of mindfulness, which probably most of us don't do because it's kind of a little bit jarring and probably wouldn't necessarily be appropriate to do in many contexts, is a corpse decay. The Buddha actually walks you through these 9 stages. And as you probably know, in the Thai forest tradition, some of these Buddhist monks would get instructed to go sit at the charnel grounds and actually observe rotting, decaying bodies and being like, you're going to be there at some point. And, knowing that, what do you want to do now? I don't think I've ever been on a retreat where they actually taught that teaching, but it's in there. in one of the teachings of actually loving kindness is the first foundation of practice. So, and also if we look at our society now, especially here in America, people have all kinds of dysfunctional, destructive relationships with their body. We don't like the way our body looks. We don't like the gender of our body. We don't like the age of the body. We don't like the size of the body. We're very, very self-conscious about our bodies. A lot of hatred. I hate my body. I don't want my body to be like this. My body's too big. I wish my body wasn't so big. I wish my body was smaller. This is a feature of the modern world that seems to get more and more elaborate, more and more diverse, more and more complicated as time goes on. But ultimately, this is a mindfulness practice. This is mindfulness of dukkha. This is, I'm whether I like it or not, I am in this body. This is the vehicle that I live in. This is ground zero. Like it or not, this is where I am, which is why I think metta, loving kindness, friendliness is so crucial that we actually try to develop. And I think a lot of us have to develop a kind of friendlier, kinder relationship with our bodies. I actually just celebrated 20 years of sobriety. But I know I spent many of my early years, teen years, early 20s, struggling with drug and alcohol addiction. A lot of it because it was like I didn't want this feeling, emotional, hateful, angry, scary, traumatized body was the last place I wanted to be. But you know what? There was no exit door. And so the Buddha really starts us right there. He says, yeah, we really need to first foundation of mindfulness, first noble truth. So if you take the Four Noble Truths and the four foundations of mindfulness and you just invert those lists, you get a whole nother set of lists. So we see dukkha is in the body. Okay. And actually, I won't go too far down this rabbit hole, but it's a big set of teachings that I've been working on. There's lots of lists of fours, I'm sure you've noticed. And if you turn all the lists sideways, you get a whole nother set. In fact, you get a more useful set. So you have Four Noble Truths, four efforts, four means of accomplishment, four Brahma Viharas. Everything lines up. That's probably a talk for another occasion, but it's quite a fascinating reality. And so that's where we start. So we're trying to embrace. So we're not, I don't think, and it doesn't say so in the early text, this whole ending dukkha, the Four Noble Truths is the task, or is it not the task, but it's the path that leads to the end of suffering, I think is a bad move. I don't think it's possible. And if you look at the standard list, right, you see dukkha's in every one. There's suffering, there's the cause of suffering, there's the end of suffering, and there's the path that leads to the end of suffering. What word is in all four? Suffering, 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 suffering. Well, it's only in the first one. The Buddha's like, let's just get this out of the way, y'all. Yes, this dukkha thing is something you're going to have to deal with, but that's not the end of the story. So also, just not to get too nerdy on this, but just as an interesting idea, is we all know, and I'm sure we've all have heard that the Buddha teaches cause and effect, right? That's a big idea. But if you think about the way the Four Noble Truths are structured in 99% books on Buddhism, it's actually backwards because they say there's dukkha, and the cause of dukkha is craving. Well, they're starting with the effect. They're saying the effect is dukkha, which is caused by the craving. And then they say nibbana or nirodha, the third noble truth, the end of suffering, is caused by the developing of the Eightfold Path. So that always struck me as odd. And as somebody who's not educated and grew up with a lot of learning disabilities, I just thought I wasn't smart enough. I just thought I was a dumbass and couldn't understand this Four Noble Truth teaching. But then years later, studying, looking at stuff, I'm like, oh, actually, somebody somewhere along the line seemed to have kind of got them kind of inverted. If we're going to go with the cause and effect theory, that doesn't work so good. So what the Buddha is saying in the original text is that, yes, there's dukkha. We need to embrace that dukkha. And then what happens is what arises. So the key word in the second noble truth is samudaya, which is usually translated as cause or origin. But if you look in the Pali English dictionary, if you look at the etymology of the word, which you can easily do now, it doesn't mean cause or origin at all. It actually means arising or rising up. So what happens is tanha, reactivity, craving, rises up as a result of dukkha. So again, it's more not, it's not that A causes B, but B is dependent upon A. So craving and tanha and reactivity depends on dukkha to be there, and then it rises up. And how does it rise up? It rises up, it gets this grubby little paws on us through the second foundation of mindfulness. So now we have 2 and 2. Feeling tone. You've probably heard Vedana feeling tone, and I'm sure you've heard this theory, and I'm sure you've experienced this theory moment by moment, is that when things are pleasant and enjoyable, I cling, right? I want to have the pleasant feeling. When things are unpleasant or disagreeable or painful, I want to push those things away, right? This is called the pleasure pain dichotomy. This is well clearly articulated in great precision in the teachings on the 12 links of dependent origination. We have contact, we have feeling, we have craving. And so the second foundation of mindfulness, which is to be mindful of the feeling tonality of the experience, which applies towards what's called name rupa, but really the mind and the body and the emotional system. And I don't know about you, but they talk about these feeling tones. There's pleasure and there's pain. There's neither. My favorite one, and I suspect it's true for most of you, is the pleasant one. That's my favorite of the three. I really like the pleasant feeling. I really don't like the unpleasant feeling. And I think that that's built into the apparatus. I mean, I have a 4-year-old kid downstairs, and when he hears the word no, he freaks out. He can't handle it. He hears the word no, it's unpleasant in his system, and he totally reacts. I didn't teach him that. I'll tell you what, you hang out with a 4-year-old, and you will learn very quickly that people like pleasant and they hate pain. I mean, that's just his whole operating system, right? So part of mindfulness, the feeling tone, is to, I think the reason why the Buddha is asking us to learn how to monitor this is he's trying to get us to catch the stirrings, the rumblings of reactivity as soon as we can. Right, noticing that when things are pleasant, what rises up naturally, organically, probably neurobiologically, and this is probably pretty well documented. There's a book by a guy named Robert Wright, or I have it over here, called Why Buddhism is True. Totally interesting book if you haven't read it. He's a evolutionary psychologist. He teaches at Rutgers University in New Jersey. He's not really a Buddhism kind of guy. He's kind of a nerdy New Jersey academic teacher from Rutgers. He wrote this book called Why Buddhism is True, because what he says is that from the view or the perspective of evolutionary psychology, this pleasure pain dichotomy, these 12 links of dependent origination, this really early Buddhist thought is actually totally backed up by science. He's like, yeah, he was right about that. That's how we operate. We can't but help it. You know, I put a piece of food into my mouth. I know immediately whether I like it or whether I don't like it. You know, food is a good example. I mean, how often do you eat a piece of food and sit there for 3 minutes and go, do I like this? I can't tell if I like this. It's pretty good. It's kind of too salty. I don't know. You just know. Pleasant, unpleasant. The good thing about food is we usually can make sure we don't put unpleasant food in our mouth. So we kind of have a lot of control over that one. But that's kind of how we are wired. So being mindful of this helps us understand where we can intervene on the craving or the reactivity. I use the word reactivity. I don't think there's actually a great word, frankly. This word tanha, which is usually gets translated as craving, really kind of means thirst, which again isn't great. The reason I don't like the word craving is craving to me implies too much wanting. Like I'm craving ice cream, or I'm craving attention, or I'm craving connection. But tanha means both craving as in terms of wanting. It also means craving in terms of not wanting. So I think, and I don't think there's a great one English term that really sums this up. I use the word react because I think that's okay. But I react when things are very, very pleasant or agreeable. My typical reaction is to try to acquire that. If things are very, very unpleasant or unwanted, I'm kind of reacting. I'm trying to get rid of that. Another way to think about it, and I think this is true. I think the word tanha could easily be translated as addiction. It's kind of the way that and so we know craving. If you follow craving on the links of dependent origination, you get craving, and then you get clinging or grasping, or upadana, which means to grasp, to cling, to fuel. And once we get into that territory, we're usually kind of in big trouble, right? And so we see that part of the so the task of the second truth, let's say, I call it the task, I think that's a better word, mindfulness, and the second noble truth is to recognize and overcome these reactive patterns. Another way to say that would be to recognize and overcome what's known as greed, hatred, and confusion, typically called greed, hatred, and delusion, but I don't think delusion is quite the right term. confusion. And so that's our kind of primary reaction, right? And so tanha, this word tanha, is really just shorthand for greed, hatred, and confusion. Greed, once again, if things are enjoyable, I want to have them. If things are disagreeable, I want to get rid of them. And if things are neither, I'm mostly confused. And what really confuses me the most is that I've been almost around for 50 years. I've invested a lot of time and energy into trying to get what I want and avoid what I don't want. And I'm still a bit confused that that hasn't worked yet. Not only am I confused that that hasn't worked yet, I'm totally confused as why the hell I still do it. You know what I mean? I do it. I'm going to do it today. I know I'm going to go somewhere today and I'm going to do it again. I can't not do it, because I get so tricked. I'm like, well, this time it's going to work. Right. And so that's the whole puzzle of the human experience. Why doesn't this work? And growing up in America, I know you're not all in America, so I don't want to assume that. But the general, I think, assumption in American culture is that the goal of life and what happiness means I've gotten what I've wanted and I've avoided what I haven't wanted. That's what we're after. That's American kind of behavior 101. Get what you want, get rid of what you don't want. And the other thing, to put ethics on the table here, the big problem with this is a lot of times for me to get what I want and to avoid what I don't want, I got to hurt some other people in the process. And some people are more than willing to hurt whoever they have to hurt or to step on anybody they have to step on to get what they want and what they don't want. So it's not so much about this subjective experience of I want to end craving so I'm not suffering and reacting anymore. A lot of Second Noble Truth, overcoming reactivity, is about ethics. It's about like, you know what, man, I got to stop hurting myself and other people. Yes, I want to get what I want, but I'm not going to hurt other people to do that. And that's where the game really gets complicated. Because the question is, well, I really, really want this thing to happen. Well, how bad am I willing to actually hurt other people to get this thing that I want? Uh, and a lot of people have no problem with that. Or they don't actually aren't sophisticated, or they don't have the self-honesty to admit to themselves that they're stepping on other people to get what they want and to avoid what they don't want. So to me, to think about the second noble truth as ending suffering or getting rid of suffering, sure, that's part of it. I'm not going to deny that. But to me, there's way more going on that's way more interesting and way important. And to me, the big one that's super important is the ethics. Like, I want to be a good person. I want to help other people. I want to be supportive of other people. I look at the world that we live in and I see all the shit that goes on. I'm like, I don't want to contribute to this. Well, if I don't want to contribute to this, then I have to be willing to look at my own relationship to these systems that are born in, that are built into my evolutionary system, not my fault. And also, again, I'm not a bad person. I'm not bad or wrong because I oftentimes fall asleep to or I get overcome by greed, hatred, and confusion. Right? It's just part of my practice. But as a Dharma practitioner, I've, made a value judgment to say, I want to live in a different kind of way. And when you merge mindfulness and the Four Noble Truths and you look at them from a practice-based perspective, the whole thing becomes a lot more interesting, right? How do I overcome my reactive patterns? And again, yet another way to look at this tanha, if you could look at it through greed, hatred, or confusion, you could also look at it through the hindrances. So all these teachings are second noble truth, second task territory. Overcome reactivity means I'm trying to overcome greed, hatred, and confusion. Means I'm trying to become an ethical person. Means I'm trying to be aware of and to recognize and to overcome hindrances. Craving and aversion, once again. There's craving and aversion again. They show up everywhere because that's the primary stance. I want this and I want to get rid of that. And I'll do whatever I have to do to get this and to get rid of that. And that's a very strong force in the mind. Lethargy, restlessness, doubt, right? So these are that. So we try to overcome those. So the Buddha says, this is craving. He says craving is repetitive. It's obsessively indulging in this and that, right? Craving, clinging. He says it's repetitive. It's going to re-arise. It re-arises. So then he says what to do with it. He says craving can be let go of. It has been let go of. He's saying you have these features in your experience, you can recognize these features in your experience, you can see them, and you cannot be dictated by their forces. Of course, it's easy to sit here and say all this. To do it's a whole other thing. So again, he doesn't say, he just says you can overcome this. And also, second, interestingly enough, is the second great effort is also applied to the second noble truth, is to overcome destructive forces that have arisen in the mind. And that's the mindfulness practice of the second noble truth. Mindfulness of the feeling tone, trying to not be dictated by it, trying to overcome it. You know, just try that one thing tomorrow. Just use the second noble truth and the second task as just a practice. Just try it for one day, and I guarantee you will be busy all day. And then we move into the third noble truth, as it's usually called, which is usually associated with ceasing, or usually it's kind of typically translated as the end of suffering. Which again, I think is really, really kind of a bad move, because it doesn't actually say that in the text. When he talks about the nirodha, the ceasing, he says the traceless fading away of that craving. So when he defines what the third noble truth is, or really nibbana, as the word we would use, nibbana, which is a big term in Buddhist thought. Nibbana literally is an ancient Indian cooking term, which means to remove the pan from the flame. Greed, hatred, confusion, another shorthand for those are the fires, these three fires. So if you want to be liberated, if you want to be nibbanic, if you want to have a meaningful life, the goal of the practice essentially is to put out the fires of greed, hatred, and confusion. And he says when you do that, when you remove the mind, or the pan in this case, from those flames, the mind cools down. And it doesn't say that dukkha goes away. It says the traceless fading away of that craving, that tanha. So the third noble truth, if you look at the Pali text, doesn't say the end of dukkha. It says you've overcome craving in that moment, and now you're in a non-reactive mind. You're in a mind that's present, a mind that's cool, which I love this word cool. I love nibbana as cool, because when you look at, especially here in the States, probably true in the UK, one term that has continued to maintain its status within kind of slang or kind of colloquial language is the word cool. We still use the word cool, right? When you describe one of your friends that you really like, you say, oh, my friend Joe's coming over. You're going to love my friend Joe. He's cool. What does that mean? That means he's nibbanic, man. He's not reactive. It means he's easy to be around. People who are cool are generally people who are easy to be around. When you're in the presence of somebody who's cool, it's easy. That's why they're cool. They don't react. They're not super opinionated. They're not giving you unsolicited advice. They're not a quote unquote difficult person, right? And why do we say that they're cool? Is because really what they do is they embody this quality of non-reactivity. They're like little nibbanic beings. And you might have noticed that we kind of gravitate towards those kinds of people. So what you want to do, what I want to do, is I want to become that kind of person. I want to become a cool, non-reactive person that people want to be in my presence, because I'm not reactive. I'm not judgmental. I'm not pushing my views and opinions on them. I'm not telling them what they should do about their relationship or their job. I'm just friendly. I'm metta. So I'm all these qualities, all the Brahma Viharas. There's so many qualities in the taxonomy of Buddhist terms that fall in this category. You have Nibbana, the deathless, equanimity, mindfulness, Dharma, all the Brahma Viharas, generosity, all these kind of beautiful qualities of Dharma, all would fit under that category of that third task, that I've embraced my life, I've overcome that reactivity, and now I'm where I want to be. And if you look at it moment by moment, you're kind of moving through these all the time. This is unfortunately, the bad news is this is a very fast moving target. You can't just put the car in park. You can't just like park the car in Nibbana and just live from that place from now on. I would love to be able to do that. This is an ongoing moving target. That's why it's a mindfulness practice, right? And so the third truth is about the third foundation of mindfulness. It's chitta, mindfulness of the chitta. The chitta wants to be cool, wants to be nibbanic, wants to be present, wants to be easeful, right? So so when we as soon as we overcome reactivity, we're immediately pulled into the experience of nibbana, mindfulness of the chitta. So it's a mind experience. It's a mind that's non-reactive. And we would probably use this word that we use a lot in mindfulness circles is we want to witness that. And you've all witnessed it. I mean, how many times did you have an experience like that in your daily practice? Or you're on retreat somewhere and you're sitting and you have the thought to yourself, I'm totally meditating right now. You're like, you're because what's going on is you're cool. You're not reacting. You're not reacting to external stimuli. You're not reacting to internal stimuli. You're not reacting to memories and how this person did me wrong and I'm going to get them back. And you're not caught up in the future about like, you're just, none of that's going on. You're non reactive. You're cool. And you probably have noticed when you have that experience, you rather like that. We like it. And so we have to understand that's not random. You don't just slip on a banana peel and end up in a non-reactive state of awareness. You cultivate that, right? We practice that. So when we say we practice mindfulness, four foundations of mindfulness integrated into the Four Noble Truths, this is the kind of approach that we're going with, which is very pragmatic, very practical, doesn't require any soteriological belief system about past or future lives or karma or any of that stuff, which is fine. I don't have a problem with any of that. I can politely put all of that over here and say, I'm agnostic about that. I actually don't know. I have no idea. But what I do know is that I react a lot. And I do know that when I overcome that reactivity, I feel good. So I'm going to stick with that theory because I have tons and tons of boatloads of evidence in my own personal experience that that is really good for me. It's also good for the people around me, right? So therefore, it's very pragmatic. It's prescription. It's prescriptive based. It's like, do these things, notice the outcome. Do these things, notice the outcome. Not believe these things and hope that things work out someday. So again, it's a very engaged practice of Dharma. It's very much engaged with experience, which I find to be insanely helpful. So I just want to see a few nods. You guys are with me. You've probably heard this stuff before. I hope that I'm not speaking too esoterically or anything. This is like really, I think, the kind of stuff that I deal with all the time. And I won't say a lot about the last one because it's the Eightfold Path, but just to kind of reiterate this cause and effect, it is usually what they'll say, and I'm sure you've heard, is that the Eightfold Path is the path that leads to Nibbana, the path that leads to the end of the suffering. Again, I think that's backwards, because that's effect. So the cause is Nibbana, the effect the effect is nibbana. What causes nibbana is the cultivation of the Eightfold Path. I think that's backwards. I think nibbana, the third noble truth, the third foundation of mindfulness, is the trailhead. You know this word trailhead? You go to a mountain to go hiking and you come to the trailhead, which is where you enter all the paths to go up the mountain. Nibbana is the trailhead. So from a nibbanic mind that's present, that's easeful, that's aware, that's kind, that's generous, that's benevolent, when I'm in that experience, then I enter the Eightfold Path, right? So Nibbana, the third noble truth, grants me access to the path, not the other way around, which is great because the other thing that's so great about looking at it this way is this is all immediate stuff. Because part of it, I know I get into this thing, I'm like, if I just trudge the road of the Eightfold Path, maybe someday I'll get to the end of it's like kind of like the goal becomes way down the road, like maybe someday I'll get my shit together. But what this is saying is no, this is all immediate. This is moment by moment. So nibbana again is also it's not a state, it's not a noun, it's a nibbana-ing is what we're trying to do. So nibbana, just like mindfulness, is a moment to moment skill. Some moments I have it, some moments I don't. You can't just park into it. So again, this is why, we practice mindfulness. We try to track moment by moment experience. And one of the skills that we develop is mindfulness in the third noble truth, mindfulness of Nibbana, betters our views. So if I'm in a non-reactive state of mind, I have right view. My views about things, my perspective on life is a lot more skillful. My intentionality, my imagination is a lot more skillful. My words, the way I communicate with other people, the emails that I send, the texts that I send, are a lot more skillful. They're a lot less harmful. They're a lot more constructive when I'm in that state of mind. If I'm in a reactive state of mind, if I'm caught up in that whole second noble truth territory, I'm caught up in hindrances, I'm wanting this and not wanting that, the words that come out of my mouth are not always very kind, you know. So now we're back to the ethics again. So when I speak harshly, when I behave harshly, when I become greedy around finance or money, those all those things become destructive when I'm caught up. So as soon as I get kicked back into second truth territory, if I become greedy, hateful, hindered, then the access to the path is sort of denied for that moment. I think about it, it's like this big sign that says access denied, and I don't get access again until I do the task of overcoming that reactivity, and then I can live my life. The other thing that's interesting, if you look it up in the canon, is that the Eightfold Path doesn't lead to the end of suffering. It actually leads to a city. There's a text that actually is kind of getting a lot of attention these days called the Ancient City. You can look it up. And the Buddha talks about, I followed this Eightfold Path. So he's basically saying the Eightfold Path is a very subjective way for each of us to develop a meaningful life, to develop a life of meaning and purpose, to follow our own subjective experiences, to thrive, to live harmlessly, to do well as human beings. And so it's kind of more a play on a civilization, on a way that people can live, rather than this idea that I'm going to get to Nibbana, I'm going to cultivate the Eightfold Path, and then when I die, I won't be reborn again into a human body. So, from the soteriological goal of Buddhism, the goal is to not be born again in a human body, which essentially says it's better to not be born than it is to be born. And I just cannot get behind that idea one bit. And to me, that's nihilism. You know, so I think that when you kind of turn it around, it's more an engagement with life, an active engagement and embracing, an understanding, a willingness to say, I'm saying yes to life, rather than this kind of, you know, money's wrong, the world is wrong, it's all greed, hatred, and delusion. I'm just going to go over here and meditate, and I'm just going to kind of get out of this whole thing because it's just all just a big shit show, which kind of is. But this is a whole different way of approaching it. We're saying yes to these things rather than saying no to these things. Um, so I'm going to stop there. I could go on and on. I'm not going to. I want to do a practice. So now what we'll do is we'll practice these here for maybe 15 or 20 minutes to just see if we can go through these 4 tasks and these 4 foundations of mindfulness, and then we'll have some dialogue if that sounds okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. As you can see, I've had plenty of caffeine today. I taught a class earlier today, so I'm all fired up. So you can take a few moments to just kind of find a comfortable way to sit. And I'll start and end with the bell. So as we begin the practice, we're going to integrate these ideas of this first task to embrace life. So we embrace life by bringing full mindfulness into your body, coming into contact with the fact that you are inside of a living, breathing body. You can breathe in, know that you're breathing in, breathing out, know that you're breathing out, feeling the arising of the in-breath, fading away of the out-breath. to pour the awareness of mind down through the body to feel all of the different areas in the body where there might be comfort or discomfort, too warm, too cold, whether the body feels content and rested, or if the body is tired or agitated. And to really, most importantly, if nothing else, to bring an attitude of kindness towards the body. This is my body. This is my breath. This body and breath have sustained my life moment by moment up now until this very moment. Breathing in, breathing out, to fully embrace, experience the body just as the body is. And practicing that here together for some time. And so as we do this, we see quickly perhaps that the mind wanders off or becomes preoccupied with different contents of experience, plans, and memories. And again, this isn't bad or wrong. This is just part of the deal. So we just return, we just re-embrace that body, that breath over and over and over again. The body is like this. May I be at ease with the body just as it is. The mind is like this. May I be at ease with the mind just as it is. There's no problem. There's no distraction. There's no doing this wrong. There's just what is it that's arising in this moment and what is my attitude or relationship to that. So that's an embracing of life, a fully touching into the truth of this moment with a kindness, with an openness, very existential. This is my life moment by moment. And to have the kindness and the generosity to fully show up for yourself, to be here for yourself. I'm here for you right now, however you are right now. Breathing that in, breathing that out. And what we see as we embrace the body, the present moment experience, that what arises out of the body system, what arises out of experiences, a wishing for things to be more pleasant, a wishing for things to be less painful, that there's a feeling in the mind, there's a feeling in the heart, there's a feeling in the body. The whole thing is feeling. It's the second foundation of mindfulness, or Vedana means to feel, to know, to feel discomfort. I know this discomfort, to feel comfort, to feel ease, to feel discontent, to feel whatever's there to be felt or to be known. That every moment, Every moment of experience is characterized by some quality of pleasure or pain or neither, and that we see so clearly in our experience that we react. We recognize, we feel something even slightly irritating or slightly uncomfortable, and we immediately want for it to be gone. We push it away. Or we might notice there's a quality in the mind that's just wanting the experience to be a little bit more pleasant, the body to be a little bit more relaxed, the mind to be less irritated, less wandering. It's okay. Just notice this mindfulness of the feeling and doing what the best we can to stay fully embraced with the body and to not react, to not try to grab at or push away. There's nothing to have, there's nothing to get rid of. Just this moment, just this breath, just this body, just like this. And so as you practice in this way, noticing the moments, there's probably many moments where there's non-reaction. You're not caught up in a struggling with the moment, needing it to be different, wanting it to be otherwise. In this nibbanic, cool, non-reactive state of mind, it's enjoyable, it's open, spacious. Cultivate that, maintain that. And to seeing that these foundations of mindfulness, these truths or these tasks are really just a moment by moment. One moment we might find that we're embracing the body, we're embracing this moment. Other moments we might find ourselves being reactive. Other moments we might feel free from that reactivity, to be fully in touch with our experience as it is. And wherever we are, moment by moment, within that structure frame of practice, we can try to just bring a quality of kindness, of friendliness. This is how it is. This is our experience. This is the body's response to reality. And what we can do, we can embrace the moment, the experience just as it is. We can overcome, we can recognize and overcome ways in which we react or we just simply want things to be different. And we can be okay, we can be accepting. We can allow things to be just as they are, however they are. All different forms of mindfulness, ways of being, as they change and arise and pass away moment by moment. And just continuing to see if we can all do this on our own for the last few minutes of the practice, to fully embrace the body, the heart, the emotion, just pouring our awareness into our being as it is. Seeing if we can be in this experience without reacting to the body, to thoughts or ideas in the mind, towards how we feel, fear, anger, joy, sadness, allowing it all to be there, not reacting to the feeling. And then to see if we can actually dwell or abide in the contemplative space of the mind, just as it is, free from desire and discontent, from craving and aversion. And so in this singular practice here, we're working both with the first three foundations of mindfulness, bring mindfulness to the body, the existential reality of the body, our relationship to how we feel, and the freedom of mind. And also these three tasks, mindfulness tasks, simple, possible, and just practicing that here together for the last few minutes. Thank you, everybody. Just want to take a brief moment to apologize. I spoke longer than I meant to. Sometimes keeping track of time, I'm usually better about it than I was this morning. So sorry about the shorter practice. But yeah, definitely time now for questions about this. I'm sure there are many, but happy to hear what other questions or thoughts you might have about this perspective. And also, Marnie, if there's any questions I might have missed in the chat, if you want to just copy and paste them and put them back in so I don't have to, looks like there's quite a few stuff in there. So looks like we have Victoria.
I think I was muted. Hi.
Hey, Victoria.
Yeah, it's great to see you again. Your eyes so refreshing. I just love your talks.
Thank you.
I have a billion questions, but I know everyone else does too. So I'm going to be really brief. But I'll just say what they are, and then you can see, if you have a sentence for each or something. The first one was about the body, and you were talking about it because it's obviously a really hot topic in our society right now with gender issues and gender identity and things like that. And I'm just, so I'm not speaking personally because I don't personally have an issue with that, but I'm just wondering, how a practicing Buddhist who wanted to be cool um, would engage with that whole issue. In other words, with embracing the body that is, for better or for worse,
Totally.
versus like wanting something else, wanting to, or wanting what one feels one was supposed to be, but wasn't, or, you know,
Totally.
all those issues.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think mostly I just land in the spirit of kindness. Is can I be kind towards what, we all have our own struggles. But yeah, I mean, I think that the ethical thing is like is to try to not have a fixed view on that. I don't know, and trying to just and I work with people who struggle in different capacities, and it's just trying to be keep the dialogue open, as much as I try to be friendly, but trying to, as a teacher, I try to teach people like these practices. See if you can befriend your body, you can practice with your body, and not to hate the body, and to work with that. And a lot of times people maybe don't want to hear that, and that can be challenging. But I think that I would try to start there maybe first, is like, okay, like these, really try to embrace these foundations of mindfulness. And just as you take a practice on, I think the foundations of mindfulness, and particularly this conversation, can be really, really healing for people who struggle with the body in whatever capacity they struggle with the body. I mean, I'm almost 50 years old. I've been 25, 30 pounds overweight for 25 years, and I know exactly what to do. And sometimes I hate my body, and I want to eat more than I want to eat. I think a lot of it is like, it's easy to overlook this stuff, but we do live in this body. And I think before we get into big changes, I think one of the things we would be served by just trying to have a better, more kind, more friendly, caring relationship with our body as it is, and maybe start there first before we get into the weeds on all these other different things that are happening now.
Great, thanks. One other, so then another really quick one is with the Nibbana, the taking the pan off the stove and letting it cool down. One issue I've had ever since I delved into the Dharma and sort of did a deep dive is the issue of like, I'm half Italian, so like passion, like where does passion come in? Like, because I think of this, the pan coming off the stove and it's lukewarm. I mean, like you want to eat
Yeah,
the food
sure.
hot. So
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
kind
At
of,
what point is it hot? So it's like,
yeah, like I want
yeah,
to be cool, but I also want to eat my food hot. So where does
I
passion
get it.
come in?
Well, I think there's an easy way to think about this, and I think that it actually is more about desire. And desire sometimes gets a bad reputation in Buddhist thought, but it really shouldn't. And I think that's a mistake, because technically desire is an ethically neutral, occasional mental factor. And desire is not good or bad, wholesome or unwholesome. It just sort of depends.
Hmm.
So I think part of it is like, it's just subjectively trying to live within my desire system, knowing that I'm not going to get it right. It's like, but keeping it in the desire without letting it get into craving and reactivity.
Hmm.
Like, can I have, like, so I have a desire to get something. Can I be okay with it if it doesn't happen? It's
Mm-hmm.
when I have a desire, and that if this doesn't happen, I'm not going to be okay, and I'm going to do whatever I need to do to make sure. That's where that desire gets. So the desire gets easily corrupted by greed, hatred, and confusion, and then it's not desire anymore. It's actually more tanha.
Mm-hmm.
So trying to just, and I think one of the hardest things to do is to just be honest with ourselves about our desire system. Like, this is what I like. This is what I want. I can't help it. And to have a healthy level of respect for it, to not repress it or suppress our desire, which is unhealthy, but to not necessarily indulge it either.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what we're tasked with the burden of, how do I find a middle way around my desire system where I have a healthy relationship to my desires, but I'm not suppressing them, nor am I indulging them. And I'm probably going to drop the ball a lot of the times anyway, and that's okay.
I love it. Thank
But
you.
I think the question I think you're talking about is desire, and how do we come to terms with that? And I think the
Well, it's just not
desire,
be, it's just because I think those of us who are householders, as it says in the sutras, and we're not monastics, it's hard to imagine just kind of being like constantly in this, like such
no,
perfect.
totally not possible for us. I
Yeah,
mean,
like
sometimes
so
I have a
cool.
hard day. And I need to just like watch 7 Netflix shows and eat pizza and ice cream. Like, I just, like, you know what I mean? Like, that's part of my experience. So we have to make room for that. And, we don't have a really healthy or great roadmap on how to do that, which is probably why you asked the question.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. You're great. Thank you.
No, thank you. Much appreciated.
I have sent you 3 questions, and a 4th one has just now come in. The first one
Okay.
is, I just texted you by Elizabeth.
Okay. Can you just ask it so I don't have to go scrolling through all this because that'll get me
Absolutely.
distracted?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Elizabeth would love to hear a bit more about your messy path,
Oh
specifically how
boy.
you've come to accept that messiness and glean something from it.
Yeah, I mean that's the best thing to do with it. Also, too, I want to welcome anybody. I'll put my email address. My email address is, well, I'll put it in the chat. If you want to email me and have a further conversation down the road, I have time and space for that, and that might be better here. But also I have a podcast called Dave Smith Dharma, and I probably address a lot of that in my talk. But part of it is like, um, life, dukkha, human experience is messy. And I think that we sometimes can get into a Dharma practice or a practice like this thinking that if we do it correctly, we're somehow going to avoid or not have to deal with the messiness of the human experience, which I've tried to do and have failed miserably. And I don't encourage that we try to do it that way. But I think that to me, the question is really a first task practice. How do I embrace the messiness of my life? How do I find a degree of ease and a degree of acceptance around the fact that this all is quite a big messy ride? And it's okay. I think that's the big message. It's okay that it's messy. It's not your fault that it's messy. It's just how reality operates. We live in a very strict reality. And reality doesn't care about my wishes and my wants and my not wants and my desires and my discontents. Reality is behaving on its own by itself. And I can either try to embrace that and get on board with that and participate with that, or I can fight and resist that, and I go back and forth between the two. But I think I've never found another way of thinking. For me, the Dharma is the most sophisticated, intelligent, pragmatic, useful way on how to do that. And that's kind of what I would say I've been after for the last 30 years. And I've been doing it with varying degrees of success. And I'm okay with that.
Thank you. And the next question is, I think we're saying this correctly. Is it Joanna? Please share your thoughts regarding karma as precondition rather than predetermined. Also, rebirth versus reincarnation.
Yeah, karma, rebirth, reincarnation. I politely put all of that stuff aside. Um, I don't really know. I mean, I think first of all, the word karma is a word that's used by many ancient Indian traditions, and everybody has a different definition for it. So karma is kind of a ball of mess. I mean, when the Buddha talks about karma, he actually says it's kind of somewhere between determination and random chaos. So it's, kind of a tricky thing. Rebirth and reincarnation, those were ideas that were floating around in ancient India. I don't believe the Buddha had much to say about those. And the reason I say that, if you look in the Pali Canon, and it's a big volume of work, there's not one teaching on the teaching of karma. Like there's all these teachings. Here's the teachings on mindfulness. Here's the teachings on the form. He's always giving teachings and they all have a title. Well, there's not one teaching that says, yo, monks, here's karma and here's how karma works. He never does that. Nor does he ever say, yes, monks, there is this thing called rebirth and reincarnation and here's how it works. He never does that. There's not one sutta on those things. So I think I would say at best, he was probably agnostic about those things. I think what he would say is that those things are sort of irrelevant to what he teaches. And of course, Buddhism went on and on to have many different things. There's many schools of Tibetan Buddhism that go down these elaborate rabbit holes on karma, rebirth, reincarnation. I mostly just politely put it aside because I really don't know, nor do I suspect I'll ever sort it out. So I don't really think that it's necessarily that important or valuable that we get caught up in the weeds around those ideas.
Thank you. Jenny asks, could you please say more about how the first noble truth is the cause of the second noble truth?
Yeah, it's interesting cause. It's not really so much cause. So here's another thing. I don't think the Buddha is really interested in cause and effect as much as he's interested in interdependence. Now, so that would say, like, we could say like causality would be A caused B, okay? A caused B because there's dukkha, that causes the reactivity to arise. That's mostly true. But if you look at it differently and it's more difficult but more important is A didn't cause B, but B is dependent upon A to arise. So that some people say, well, that's the same. It's actually not quite. It's quite different. So it's not that A caused B, but B, reactivity. For reactivity to happen, it depends on A to be there. So it's interdependent. It's not causal. And that's a lot harder for us to wrap our heads around because you can never really sort that out. So then the question becomes, well, what are the conditions for A and how do these things work? So it's more, I think it's better to, or I found it to be better to understand these teachings more as, or these tasks or these links of dependent origination. There's that word dependent, is that things are interdependent. They're not causal. So I hope that's helpful. But because I live in a born human body that has all these feelings and all this stuff, because there's dukkha, reactivity arises. So dukkha is the condition in which the arising comes out of. It didn't cause it. It's just a condition for it to arise, which is somewhat the same, but actually quite different. I hope that doesn't make things more complicated, but I think that's the more helpful way to look at it. I also think it's the more accurate way to look at it. I don't think the Buddha teaches causality as much as he teaches interdependence, which unfortunately for most of us, interdependence is a lot more complicated to sort out than causality.
Thank you. We have two more. The next one's by Sat. It's let's see, question. With all of this, how do you deal with someone who you are in relationship with when they are self-centered, greed-focused on money? And I have been working on disengaging and I have forgiven, I think, but any suggestions?
Yeah, it's tough. Other people make this a lot harder. You know, without knowing a lot about it, I would say, you know, sometimes the obvious answer is sometimes, and I've had to do this many times, sometimes we have to end and exit relationships with people because it's not helpful for our well-being. And sometimes that's possible. Sometimes it's always possible, but sometimes it's a lot more difficult and a lot easier to stay in because we're used to the familiarity of it. The other thing that's just kind of obvious is, maybe it's obvious, is that sometimes we are so preoccupied. One of our big reactions is, and this happens to me a lot, is my reaction to other people is I need that person to be different so I can be happy. You know, I need you to be different. And that's not really helpful either. So one thing I've noticed about the Dharma trail, and I tell this to a lot of people, is the farther down the Dharma road you get, it gets thinner. There's less travelers. We lose people along the way. The road becomes more narrow. But I have also found, on a positive note, the quantity of people that are in my life becomes less, but the quality of people in my life becomes more. So I end up having very rich, very meaningful, very beautiful relationships with a smaller number of people than having this kind of large number of acquaintances. And maybe it's just a product of getting older and having kids, but I've certainly found that to be the case. So sometimes we lose people along the way, and sometimes we have to choose to be free from that. And that's painful. That's dukkha for you, right? I mean, you're not going to come to the end of that. If you do, please tell me how you got there, because I would love to figure that one out.
One more question that I see by I Feng. Is craving for love considered tanha? It seems to me very hard to say it's okay with not feeling loved.
Yeah, I think that's back to the other question I answered. I think that's a desire thing. And love, of course, is a complicated word, but I think mostly love is a beautiful thing. You know, I think mostly I would put love in the positive emotional category, but I think it's more of a desire. So a desire for that love. But I think even again, I found, and I believe that I really need to have it for myself first and foremost. That sense of inner kindness, metta, really, metta brahma vihara, sila brahma vihara, a goodness and integrity around that. It's like if I can close my eyes and love, dare I say, the person that I'm in here with, then all the other stuff becomes a lot easier. But the problem is if I get into that tricky business of I'm not okay unless this other person loves me, I'm somehow fundamentally flawed, and the only way to fix the fundamentally flawedness of myself is to try to acquire love from some external person, and that will solve that dilemma. Then you're really asking for trouble to some degree. You know, as the Buddha says, seek no external salvation. So I think when we have a foundation of love, kindness for ourselves, then that project becomes a lot easier, and we're a lot wiser in our ability to figure out, first of all, to find people who can actually reciprocate it. Because some people are actually, it's not that they won't love us or that they can't love us, or not that they won't, they're just kind of unable, you know? And so, you know, if we find ourselves in a situation like that, it's not that we're unworthy or that they're mean. It's that they're just sort of, sometimes we're just trying to get things, acquire things from things. It's just incapable. They're just, it's not even possible. And so, you know, if we find that to be the case, then we probably need to look elsewhere. And I think first and foremost, we should always be looking within for these qualities.
There's one more, and this one's about grief. Could you say something about moving through grief by Dawn?
Yeah, grief's a loaded word. I actually believe, and I also have a whole lot of clinical training as well as Dharma training. And I think that clinically or therapeutically, I think that the way we go about grief is really problematic. People talk about grief as a process. We all need to go the process of grief. I don't know if that's necessarily true. I think one of the interesting things to look at it is if you look at the near enemies of Brahmavihara practice, so compassion, karuna, the near enemy of compassion, one of the near enemies of compassion is grief. So a lot of times we can think that grieving is like a self-compassion thing when it's actually totally destructive. What I've noticed in my experience, because I've had a lot of experience with this question, is grief ultimately is a kind of problem of sadness. And I find that grief will continue to lurk and to torture me in my mind and my heart, in my inability to actually feel into the sadness that's sitting below it. So if you look at science of emotions, if you look at it from an emotional lens, which is quite helpful, grief and sadness both share the same trigger, and they both share the trigger of loss. So when there's loss in our lives, that will trigger grief and that will trigger sadness. They share the trigger. Grief is a lot more complicated. It's a lot more complex. With grief, we can feel angry at the person for dying. We can feel guilty that we died, that they died and we didn't. Grief is very complicated, where sadness is much more basic. Sadness is loss. Sadness is dorsal. Sadness is polyvagal relief. It's relief. It's sadness. It's crying. It's letting go. It's touching into the loss of the person. And I have found in my own personal experience that my ability to access sadness, once I actually do the sadness thing, the grief becomes irrelevant. It just evaporates. It's just gone. So I think when we're having a conversation about grief, when we're talking about grief, we should actually probably be talking about sadness, and we should probably be talking about the loss and what's going on there. And if we have that conversation and that experience, grief kind of takes care of itself. And that's a very unpopular thing I just said, but I certainly have found that to be the case for myself and for people that I work with. So really, if you want to sort out the grief, explore the sadness and the loss through the foundations of mindfulness, through the four truths, through everything I just said. And if you do that, the grief will be nowhere to be found.
I believe that's all the questions. There's a lot of love in the chat for you.
Oh, thank you, everybody.
I dropped your website and a link to Donna in there for folks. And whenever you're ready to conclude, I will stay on. So people who want to grab those links out of the chat, they have time after you're done.
Yeah, so I'm easy to get. So just a couple invitations. I'm davesmithdharma.com. I just redid my website. It's really simple. Everything you would ever want to know or need to know about me is in there. So you can just check out my website. It's the best way to go. If you want to email me, you can email me through the contact page on my website. I'm pretty good about it. I'm not very popular. I'm not like some well-known Dharma teacher. If you email me, there's a really good chance I'll get back in touch with you. So please feel invited to reach out if you want to further any questions. Also, I have some programs coming up. I know people are around, but if you're really interested in today's topic, you might want to check out a program called Mindfulness-Based Ethical Living, which is a program that was spearheaded by Stephen Batchelor. Him and I are teaching a program next year. There's 2 7-day retreats, which are both in California. I know that's travel complications, and there's an online component. But if you want to know more about that, check out my website through the retreat page or email me. It's a new program. There'll probably be lots of talk about it in the next coming years, but it's really another way to think about mindfulness-based ethical living, or what we call MBEL, is really mindfulness in the 4 tasks. So yeah. Also just want to say, if I've done, sometimes I talk fast. I always talk fast. I'm from Boston. You have to forgive me. I forgot that sometimes this is an international community and you may not be able to keep up with me, and I apologize for that. And if I've done or said anything that was upsetting to you, or if harmed you in any way, I please ask you for your forgiveness. And I hope forward to seeing you somewhere down the road on the path. And also much love and appreciation for the good folks at Sangha Live for continuing to include me in your work. As I often say, I'm not for everybody, and I'm certainly not for most. So if you resonate with these messages or want to stay in touch, please feel free to reach out. Again, much love to Sangha Live and to all of you all out there. Be safe. Take care of yourself. Thank you.